It seemed like just another normal day at the cozy corner cafe. The air was filled with the warm smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sweetness of pastries coming out of the oven. The cafe was a favorite spot for many people. Every day, business people, students, and tourists came through its doors to grab their favorite drinks and relax for a while. Today was no different. The cafe buzzed with activity, the sound of quiet chatter, the clicking of keyboards, and the rustling of newspapers creating a peaceful background noise. Sunlight streamed in through the large windows, casting a soft glow over the room, and the wooden tables were nearly all occupied. However, not everyone inside the cafe was there to sip on coffee or scroll through their phones. In the far corner, by the window, sat a man who looked out of place. He wore a worn-out jacket, the fabric frayed at the edges, and his shoes were old and dirty, as if they had walked through countless miles of rough roads. His beard was scruffy, and his hair peeked out from under a ragged hat that was pulled low over his eyes. To anyone who glanced at him, he appeared to be just another homeless man trying to escape the cold for a few hours. But here's the thing, he wasn't who he appeared to be. Most people didn't give him a second look. They were too busy with their own lives, too distracted by their phones or conversations to notice anything unusual about him. After all, why would they? He looked like he had nothing to offer, just another person down on his luck, perhaps hoping someone might buy him a coffee or offer some spare change. What no one realized, though, was that beneath those ragged clothes and the tired look on his face was one of the most powerful people in the world, Elon Musk. Yes, that Elon Musk. The man behind Tesla, SpaceX, and all those other groundbreaking companies. Today, however, Elon wasn't in the spotlight. Today, he was testing something, and no one in that cafe had the slightest idea. Elon had come to this cafe for a reason. He wasn't here to enjoy a latte or read the morning news. No, he had a plan, one that involved staying unnoticed for as long as possible. He wanted to see how people treated someone who looked like they had nothing. He wanted to experience what it was like to be on the other side, to feel invisible, overlooked, and maybe even judged. What he discovered that day would surprise everyone. As Elon sat by the window, quietly observing, people continued to go about their day. They ordered their drinks, chatted with friends, and scrolled through their social media feeds. Some of them threw quick glances at the man in the corner, but no one really paid attention. A few people whispered to each other, wondering if he was going to buy something or just take up space in the cafe all day. But no one approached him, no one asked him if he needed help, and no one tried to strike up a conversation. The barista behind the counter, a young woman named Rachel, noticed the man too. She had been working at the cafe for a few years and had seen all kinds of customers walk through the door. But there was something about this man that made her pause. He wasn't doing anything to bother anyone. He just sat there, staring out the window, deep in thought. Yet, she could feel the tension in the air. She could see the way some customers were shifting uncomfortably, not sure what to make of him. Rachel wasn't the type of person to judge someone based on their appearance. She believed in kindness and treating everyone with respect. After all, you never really know what someone is going through. She had seen too many people assume the worst about others just because of the way they looked. But today, she felt torn. Her boss, Mark, had a strict rule about people loitering in the cafe without buying anything, and she wasn't sure how long this man had been sitting there. Still, she didn't want to disturb him if he wasn't causing any trouble. As Rachel continued to make coffee and serve customers, she kept an eye on the man in the corner. She wondered what his story was. Why was he sitting there? Was he just cold and looking for a warm place to rest, or was there something more to him? He didn't look like he was asking for anything. He wasn't holding out a cup or a sign, and he didn't seem to be bothering anyone. But there was something in his eyes, something that made her think he wasn't like the others she had seen before. What Rachel didn't know was that Elon Musk had chosen this cafe on purpose. He had done this kind of thing before, blending into crowds, going unnoticed, and observing how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Today, though, he wasn't just observing for the sake of curiosity. He had a specific goal in mind, one that would soon become clear to everyone around him. For now, though, Elon stayed silent, his thoughts swirling as he watched the world around him. The people in the cafe had no idea that the man sitting in their midst was a billionaire. They had no idea that he had built rockets that could go to space or that he was working on technology that could change the world. To them, he was just another homeless man, someone to be ignored or, at worst, pitied. But that was exactly what Elon wanted. He wanted to see how people treated those they thought were beneath them. He wanted to understand how much kindness and humanity still existed in everyday interactions. And as he sat there, unnoticed and unimportant, he began to see things more clearly than ever before. Hours passed, and the cafe continued to hum with activity. The morning rush had come and gone, and now the cafe was filled with the quieter crowd, people working on their laptops, students studying for exams, and a few regulars who came in every day to enjoy a peaceful break from the outside world. Elon remained in his corner, watching, thinking, and waiting. At one point, Mark, the cafe owner, walked in. He was a tall man with a stern look on his face, always dressed in crisp shirts and polished shoes. Mark ran the cafe with an iron fist. He cared deeply about the business and was always quick to notice if something was off. Today, as soon as he walked in, his eyes landed on the man by the window. "What's going on here?" Mark muttered to himself, noticing the ragged appearance of the man sitting in his cafe. He didn't like the idea of someone who looked homeless taking up space without buying anything. To him, it was bad for business. It made paying customers uncomfortable, and Mark was all about keeping his cafe running smoothly. Rachel saw Mark approaching the counter and knew what was coming. She had seen this look on his face before, the look of someone about to make a scene. "Rachel," Mark said sharply, glancing over at the man by the window. "How long has that guy been sitting there?" Rachel hesitated. "I'm not sure, he's been here for a while, but he hasn't caused any trouble." Mark frowned. "Well, he's making the place look bad. We can't have people sitting around who aren't paying customers. Go over there and ask him to leave." Rachel bit her lip. She didn't want to be rude, but she also didn't want to lose her job. Mark could be strict, and she knew he wouldn't take kindly to her disobeying his orders. But still, she felt uneasy about telling the man to leave. He didn't seem like he was bothering anyone. In fact, he seemed to be minding his own business, quietly observing the world around him. "Okay," Rachel said reluctantly, wiping her hands on her apron and heading toward the man. As she approached, she noticed once again the calmness in his eyes, the way he seemed so at peace despite his appearance. She took a deep breath and spoke softly, not wanting to come across as harsh. "Excuse me, sir," Rachel began, her voice gentle. "I'm really sorry to bother you, but my boss, well, he asked me to check if you'd like to order something." The man looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, there was silence, and then, in a voice that was both calm and surprisingly clear, he replied, "I'll be leaving soon. But before I go, I'd like to ask you something." Rachel blinked, caught off guard by the response. She hadn't expected him to speak so confidently. She had expected him to mumble an apology or quietly slip out the door. But instead, he remained seated, his gaze steady. "What would you like to ask?" Rachel inquired, curious now. The man smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Do you believe people should be judged by how they look?" Rachel shook her head without hesitation. "No, I don't think so. I believe everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and respect, no matter what they look like." The man's smile widened slightly. "Good. I think you'll understand what I'm about to say, then. Before Rachel could respond, the man stood up, pulling off his hat and smoothing back his hair. For the first time, she saw him clearly, and it was as if the disguise fell away in an instant. The scruffy, homeless man was gone, and in his place stood Elon Musk. Rachel's eyes widened in shock. She had seen pictures of Elon Musk before, of course, who hadn't? But to see him standing right in front of her, after thinking he was just a random stranger, it was almost too much to believe. "I'm Elon," he said simply, offering his hand. Rachel stared at him, too stunned to speak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she managed to shake his hand. I don't understand," she stammered, her mind racing to catch up with what was happening. "What are you doing here?" Elon chuckled softly. "I'm here because I wanted to see how people would treat me if they thought I was just another homeless person. I wanted to see if kindness still existed in places like this." Rachel's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. All this time, the man sitting quietly in the corner of the cafe had been Elon Musk, one of the richest and most influential people in the world. And he had come here, dressed in rags, to test people's compassion. "Thank you," Elon said, his tone sincere. "You've been kind to me, even when others weren't. That's something I won't forget." Rachel felt a surge of emotion, her cheeks flushing with a mix of pride and disbelief. I was just doing what felt right." Elon nodded. "That's exactly what makes you stand out." The barista behind the counter, Rachel, sighed as she prepared another cappuccino. The steady whir of the espresso machine had become a familiar background noise in her life. She had been working at the cafe for 3 years, and while she enjoyed the routine, there were days when she felt invisible. Customers came and went, most of them too wrapped up in their own world to even acknowledge her. To them, she was just part of the background, someone who existed to take their orders and hand them their drinks. Today was one of those days. The cafe was busy, the tables nearly all full, and the noise level was higher than usual. Among the crowd, a few regulars sat at their favorite table near the counter. They were talking in low voices, but loud enough for Rachel to hear. "Do you think he's going to order something, or just sit there all day?" one of them whispered, glancing over at the homeless man sitting by the window. Rachel's hands paused for a moment as she poured the steamed milk into the cup. She felt a pang of sympathy for the man. He had been sitting there for a while, quietly watching the world go by, bothering no one. But she could sense the judgment in the air. Some people were uncomfortable with his presence, not because he was doing anything wrong, but simply because of the way he looked. She bit her lip and continued making the drink, trying to focus on her work. It wasn't the first time she had seen this kind of behavior. People were quick to judge, especially when someone didn't fit their idea of what was normal or acceptable. But what bothered her the most was that no one seemed to care about the man's story. They saw the scruffy beard, the old shoes, the worn-out jacket, and they assumed they knew everything about him. "He's just sitting there like he owns the place," another regular chimed in, his voice dripping with disdain. "Probably waiting for someone to give him something for free." Rachel's heart sank a little. She hated hearing comments like that. The man hadn't asked anyone for anything. He hadn't approached the counter or made a scene. He was just sitting quietly, minding his own business. Why was that so hard for people to accept? She glanced over at the man by the window. He hadn't reacted to the whispers, though it was hard to believe he hadn't heard them. He sat calmly, his eyes scanning the room, as if he were lost in thought. There was something about him, something in the way he observed the people around him, that made Rachel pause. He didn't seem like the type to let words like that get to him. But at the same time, there was a quiet intensity in his eyes, as if he were taking in every detail. What the customers didn't know and what Rachel couldn't possibly guess was that the man sitting by the window was not who he appeared to be. Beneath the ragged clothes and tired expression was Elon Musk, one of the most influential people in the world. And today, he was here for a reason. Elon had come to this cafe with a purpose. He wanted to see how people would treat him if they thought he was just another homeless person. It was an experiment of sorts, a way to understand how society reacted to those they deemed unimportant or beneath them. He had spent the morning observing, listening, and watching the subtle ways people interacted with him or didn't. And what he had seen so far had given him a lot to think about. As Elon sat there, he could feel the tension in the room. He had noticed the glances, the whispers, and the uncomfortable shifts of people in their seats. It wasn't anything new. He had seen it before, in different places and at different times. People had a way of making judgments based on appearances. It was almost instinctual, the way they categorized others into neat little boxes without knowing anything about them. But Elon wasn't here to get angry or to make anyone feel guilty. He was here to learn. He wanted to understand the human side of things, the way people treated those they thought were less fortunate, or less important. And so far, the results were mixed. Rachel finished making the cappuccino and handed it to the customer waiting at the counter. She couldn't stop thinking about the man by the window. Something about him didn't add up. He wasn't like the other people who sometimes wandered into the cafe, looking for a place to warm up or rest. He seemed different. But she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Mark, the cafe owner, was bustling around behind the counter, keeping an eye on everything. He was a businessman through and through, always focused on making sure the cafe ran smoothly. He noticed the homeless man too, of course, and Rachel could see the disapproval in his eyes. Mark had a strict policy about loitering. He didn't want people sitting in the cafe for too long without buying something. It wasn't good for business, he said. Paying customers didn't want to sit next to someone who looked like they couldn't afford a cup of coffee. And while Rachel understood where he was coming from, after all, the cafe was a business, she couldn't help but feel like there was more to the situation than just money. Rachel, Mark called over, nodding in the direction of the man by the window. Has that guy ordered anything yet? Rachel shook her head. No, not yet. Mark frowned, his lips pressing into a thin line. I don't like it. We've got paying customers here, and he's taking up space. If he doesn't order something soon, I'm going to have to ask him to leave. Rachel's stomach twisted. She didn't want to be the one to ask the man to leave. She didn't even know if he had money to order something, and the thought of making him feel unwelcome just because of that didn't sit right with her. But she also knew that Mark was serious. He wasn't the type to bend the rules, even for a situation like this. I'll give him a little more time, Rachel said, trying to buy the man a few more minutes. Maybe he's just deciding what to order. Mark didn't look convinced, but he didn't push the issue. He had other things to focus on, and for the moment, the man by the window wasn't causing any trouble. But Rachel knew it was only a matter of time before Mark's patience ran out. As she continued to serve customers, Rachel couldn't stop thinking about the man. She wanted to do something, but she wasn't sure what. Should she offer him a free cup of coffee? Would that even be allowed? Or should she just leave him alone and hope he decided to order something on his own? Meanwhile, Elon remained in his seat, quietly observing the interactions around him. He had seen Mark's disapproving glances, heard the whispers from the regulars, and noticed the way Rachel seemed to be caught in the middle. It was fascinating, really, how much people's behavior could change based on something as simple as appearance. If they knew who he really was, would they treat him differently? Of course, they would. But that was exactly the point. Elon had always been interested in human behavior. He liked to challenge assumptions, to see how people reacted when they were pushed outside of their comfort zones. Today, he was pushing the boundaries in a different way by making himself invisible, by becoming someone who people overlooked or judged without a second thought. And the results were both revealing and, in some ways, disappointing. But then there was Rachel. She was different from the others. She hadn't made any assumptions about him, at least not outwardly. She had treated him with the same quiet respect she gave to all the customers, even though he hadn't ordered anything. Elon could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she seemed to be struggling between doing her job and following her instincts. And that intrigued him. After a while, Rachel decided she couldn't wait any longer. She knew Mark would be on her case soon if she didn't do something. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed a menu and walked over to the man by the window. "Hi," she said softly, her voice kind but hesitant. "I'm Rachel. I work here, and I just wanted to check if you needed anything. We've got a lot of great options on the menu." Elon looked up at her, his eyes calm and thoughtful. He didn't speak right away, and for a moment, Rachel wondered if she had made a mistake. Maybe he didn't have any money. Maybe he didn't want to be bothered. But then, he smiled a small, almost knowing smile. "Thank you, Rachel," he said, his voice gentle but clear. "I'm not quite ready to order yet. I'm just observing." Rachel blinked, taken aback by the response. It wasn't what she had expected at all. Most people would have either ordered something or made an excuse to leave. But this man seemed completely at ease, as if he wasn't bothered by the fact that he hadn't ordered anything yet. And there was something about the way he said observing that made her curious. "I see," Rachel said, trying to process what he meant. "Well, if you need anything, just let me know. No rush." Elon nodded, his smile still in place. "Thank you, I appreciate that." As Rachel walked back to the counter, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this man than met the eye. He didn't seem like someone who was lost or struggling. In fact, he seemed completely in control, as if he had a plan. But what that plan was, she had no idea. Back at the counter, Mark raised an eyebrow at her. "Well? Did he order anything?" Rachel shook her head. "Not yet. He said he's just observing." Mark frowned. "Observing? What does that even mean?" "I'm not sure," Rachel admitted. "But he doesn't seem like he's causing any trouble. Maybe we can just give him a little more time." Mark didn't look happy about it, but he reluctantly agreed. "Fine. But if he's still sitting there without ordering anything in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to have to ask him to leave. We can't have people loitering." Rachel nodded, though the thought of asking the man to leave still didn't sit right with her. Something about him was different, and she had a feeling that this wasn't just a random homeless man looking for a place to sit. But she couldn't explain why she felt that way, and for now, all she could do was wait and see what would happen next. As the morning rush continued, the cafe was alive with the usual buzz of activity. The sounds of chairs scraping the floor, conversations overlapping, and the clinking of cups filled the air. Rachel moved back and forth behind the counter, taking orders and making drinks, her mind partially distracted by the presence of the man by the window. He had been sitting there for hours now, quiet and unobtrusive, yet he seemed to draw attention simply by existing. Some customers cast quick, disapproving glances at him, their faces showing discomfort. Others acted as though he wasn't even there, walking past him without a second look. But there was something about the way the man sat, his posture relaxed yet alert, that made Rachel feel like he was watching everything, taking mental notes. The more she thought about it, the stranger it seemed. He wasn't behaving like someone with nowhere to go, someone lost or wandering. No, he seemed completely in control, as if he were observing the cafe, the staff, the customers, everything. Rachel couldn't help but wonder who he really was, and what he was doing here. As the clock ticked closer to lunchtime, The cafe grew even busier. More customers streamed in, filling up the tables, creating a steady hum of conversation. Rachel did her best to keep up, handing out drinks, wiping down counters, and answering the occasional question. But even with all the activity, her thoughts kept drifting back to the man by the window. Just as she was about to serve another customer, the door to the cafe swung open, and Mark, the cafe's owner, strode in. His expression was hard, his steps brisk. Rachel noticed immediately that something was off. Mark was usually in a decent mood, but today, he looked irritated, angry, even. She followed his gaze and saw it land on the man by the window. The moment Mark saw him, his face twisted into a scowl. "What's he doing in here?" Mark muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for Rachel to hear. "He's scaring off the customers." Rachel tensed, her stomach sinking. She knew this moment was coming, but she had hoped it wouldn't. Mark was not a patient man when it came to people sitting in his cafe without buying anything, and she could tell he was about to make a scene. "Rachel," Mark said, his voice sharp, "get rid of him." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had been dreading this. Mark wasn't giving her a choice, and she knew she couldn't disobey him. He was her boss, after all, and she needed this job. But the idea of asking the man to leave made her feel uneasy. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't caused any trouble. And yet, because of how he looked, Mark was determined to get rid of him. For a moment, Rachel hesitated. She glanced at the man, who was still sitting there, seemingly oblivious to the tension brewing around him. But as she took a deep breath and started walking toward him, she caught a glimpse of something unexpected. The man raised his head slightly, and for the first time, Rachel saw his eyes clearly. They were not the eyes of someone lost or desperate. No, his eyes were sharp, focused, and intelligent. They seemed to pierce right through her, as if he could see exactly what she was thinking. In that instant, Rachel realized that there was much more to this man than anyone in the cafe had guessed. She swallowed hard, her palms sweaty as she approached him. "Sir," she began, her voice soft and hesitant, "my boss, he wants you to leave." The man didn't react the way she expected. He didn't look angry or insulted. Instead, he gave a small, knowing smile. It wasn't the smile of someone who had just been asked to leave a cafe. It was the smile of someone who was in complete control of the situation. "I'll be gone soon enough," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "But first, I think it's time for a little test." Rachel blinked, unsure of what he meant. A test? What kind of test? Her mind raced as she tried to figure out what was going on. Nothing about this made sense. But before she could ask him anything, the man stood up, smoothing out his worn jacket and adjusting his ragged hat. He looked around the cafe, his gaze sweeping over the customers, the staff, and finally, Mark, who was still watching from behind the counter. With slow, deliberate steps, the man began to walk toward the counter, where Mark stood with his arms crossed, clearly growing impatient. Rachel followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was about to happen, but something told her this was no ordinary situation. As the man reached the counter, Mark gave him a hard look, his expression cold and dismissive. "You can't just sit here without ordering anything," Mark said bluntly. "This is a business, not a shelter." The man met Mark's gaze, unfazed by his harsh tone. "I understand," he said simply. "I was just about to place an order." Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Oh? And what would you like?" The man smiled again, this time more warmly. "I'll take 1 cup of your finest coffee. Black, no sugar." Mark narrowed his eyes, clearly not convinced that the man could pay for it. But before he could say anything, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black wallet. He opened it and, to Rachel's surprise, pulled out a credit card. Not just any credit card, though this one gleamed with a platinum finish, the kind reserved for people with an unimaginable amount of wealth. Rachel's eyes widened. She had never seen a card like that before. Even Mark seemed momentarily stunned, though he quickly regained his composure. "Fine," Mark muttered, turning to the register to ring up the order. But Rachel could tell that something had shifted. The moment that credit card appeared, the dynamic between the man and Mark changed completely. Suddenly, Mark wasn't so sure of himself anymore. As Mark prepared the coffee, the man turned to Rachel, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me, Rachel," he said quietly, "how long have you been working here?" Rachel blinked, caught off guard by the question. 3 years, she replied, feeling a little nervous under his intense gaze. "Why do you ask?" The man nodded, as if considering something. 3 years is a long time. You must have seen a lot of people come and go. Rachel shrugged, unsure of where this conversation was going. "Yeah, I guess." The man smiled again, but this time it was a smile filled with meaning, as if he knew something she didn't. "It's always interesting to see how people treat those they think are beneath them." Before Rachel could respond, Mark returned with the coffee, setting the cup down on the counter with a loud clink. "Here's your coffee," he said gruffly, clearly still suspicious of the man. The man picked up the cup, taking a small sip. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if savoring the taste, then looked at Mark. "Thank you," he said simply. There was a brief, awkward silence. Rachel could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she had a feeling that this man, whoever he was, wasn't finished yet. The man took another sip of his coffee, then set the cup down on the counter. He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a business card. Without a word, he handed it to Mark, who hesitated for a moment before taking it. Mark's eyes widened as he read the name on the card. His face went pale, and his mouth opened and closed as if he were trying to say something but couldn't find the words. Rachel watched, confused and curious, as Mark's entire demeanor changed in an instant. "Why, Yuri," Mark stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're Elon Musk." The man, "No," Elon Musk nodded slowly, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Yes, I am." Rachel's heart nearly stopped. "Elon Musk? The billionaire? The CEO of Tesla and SpaceX?" The man sitting in the cafe, dressed like a homeless person, was Elon Musk? She couldn't believe it. It didn't make any sense. Why would someone like him be sitting in a small cafe, pretending to be homeless? Elon seemed to sense her confusion. "I came here today to see how people would treat me if they thought I was just another homeless man," he explained, his voice calm and steady. "It's amazing what you can learn about human nature when people don't know who you really are." Rachel felt a wave of shock and disbelief wash over her. All this time, she had been serving one of the richest and most powerful men in the world without even realizing it. Mark, on the other hand, looked like he had seen a ghost. He was fumbling for words, trying to apologize, trying to explain himself, but Elon simply waved him off. "There's no need to apologize," Elon said, his tone gentle but firm. "I've seen what I needed to see." With that, he turned to Rachel, giving her one last smile. "Thank you for your kindness, Rachel," he said. It didn't go unnoticed. And with that, Elon Musk turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Rachel and Mark standing there in stunned silence. The room was still as everyone tried to process what had just happened. The group of business people who had just walked in stood silently, observing the scene with serious expressions. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at Elon Musk, who only moments ago had seemed like just another ordinary, scruffy man. Now, his posture had changed. He no longer slouched but stood tall, radiating the confidence and authority that came with being one of the most powerful people in the world. Mark, the cafe owner, looked as though he'd been hit by a truck. His face had gone ghostly pale, and he was struggling to form a coherent sentence. I didn't realize. I didn't know it was you, Mr. Musk, Mark stammered, his voice shaky with disbelief. Elon gave a small, amused smile, but there was something sharp in his gaze. No, you didn't, he said, his tone calm but with an edge that made the entire cafe feel tense. And that's exactly why I came here today. Rachel, who had been watching the whole interaction, felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her: shock, awe, and a strange sense of validation. She had known from the beginning that something about this man was different, but never in a million years had she expected him to be Elon Musk. The customers who had sneered at Elon earlier now sat frozen in their seats, their eyes wide and their faces full of regret. They had been quick to judge, assuming he was a homeless man who didn't belong in their midst. But now, confronted with the truth, they were speechless. Elon turned to the group of businessmen and women who had entered with him. "Take notes," he said to them. "This is what happens when people make assumptions based on appearances." The business people immediately began typing on their tablets, making quick notes as Elon continued speaking. "I wanted to see how people would treat someone they thought had nothing to offer," Elon explained, his voice carrying through the cafe. "And what I saw was revealing." He glanced at Mark, whose face was now flushed with embarrassment. "You were ready to throw me out without a second thought. Because of how I looked." Mark's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His usual confidence had completely vanished. I didn't mean to offend you, Mr. Musk." Elon held up a hand, silencing him. "It's not about offending me. It's about how you treat people in general. The way you judged me without knowing anything about me, that's what's important." The weight of Elon's words seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on everyone in the cafe. Rachel stood there, taking it all in, her mind racing. She thought back to how Mark had been so quick to dismiss the man he thought was a homeless person, how the customers had whispered and sneered. It made her stomach churn. She had seen this happen before, people assuming things about others based on nothing more than how they looked. Elon's gaze softened slightly as he turned to Rachel. "But not everyone made assumptions," he said, his voice warmer now. "Rachel, you treated me with respect, even when you didn't know who I was. You didn't judge me or try to push me out of the cafe." Rachel's face flushed with surprise and embarrassment. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge her like that. She had just been trying to do what felt right. "Thank you," Elon said sincerely. "It didn't go unnoticed." Rachel swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She nodded, unable to find the right words to respond. All she could do was smile, feeling a mix of pride and humility at the same time. Meanwhile, Mark was still standing there, looking as though he wished he could disappear into the floor. He finally managed to speak, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Musk. If I had known." Elon interrupted him again, this time more firmly. "That's the problem, Mark. You shouldn't treat people differently just because of what you think you know about them. Everyone deserves respect, regardless of their appearance or status." Mark nodded rapidly, clearly desperate to redeem himself. "You're right, Mr. Musk. I'll do better. I'll treat everyone fairly from now on." Elon's expression softened just a little, but his gaze remained steady. "I hope you do," he said quietly. "Because how you treat people, especially those you think are beneath you, says more about you than anything else." There was another moment of silence, heavy and thick. Rachel could feel the shift in the room. The customers, the staff, even Mark, everyone was reflecting on their own behavior, their own assumptions. After a long pause, Elon glanced at his watch and then back at the group of business people. "We have to go." There's a meeting we're already late for. The business people nodded and began gathering their things, but before Elon turned to leave, he looked around the cafe one last time. This was more than just a test for me, he said, his voice steady and serious. It was a reminder that we need to be better, to be kinder, more thoughtful, and less judgmental. I hope today's lesson sticks with all of you. With that, he nodded toward Rachel, a final gesture of appreciation, and then turned to walk toward the door. The business people followed him, and soon, the door closed behind them, leaving the cafe in stunned silence. Rachel stood there, still trying to process everything that had just happened. The customers began whispering among themselves, their voices hushed, but Rachel wasn't paying attention to them. Her mind was spinning with everything she had just witnessed. Mark, who had been standing frozen in place, finally let out a long breath, his face still pale. He glanced at Rachel, looking more humbled than she had ever seen him. I had no idea, he muttered, almost to himself. I can't believe that was Elon Musk. Rachel nodded, still feeling a mix of shock and awe. Neither can I, she whispered. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, silently absorbing the reality of what had just occurred. The mood in the cafe had completely shifted. What had started as an ordinary day had turned into something none of them would ever forget. Mark finally cleared his throat and straightened his shoulders, trying to regain some semblance of control. I need to rethink how I run this place, he said quietly, more to himself than to Rachel. I can't believe I almost threw him out. Rachel looked at him, feeling a strange sense of compassion. For all his flaws, Mark seemed genuinely shaken by what had happened. She could tell that he was trying to process the lesson he had just learned. I think we all have something to learn from this, Rachel said softly. Not just you. Mark glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. He nodded slowly, as if he were finally starting to understand. You're right. For the rest of the day, the cafe seemed quieter than usual, even though there were still customers coming and going. The energy had shifted, and Rachel could tell that everyone was still thinking about what had happened. She, too, couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind, the way Elon had revealed himself, the lessons he had shared, the way he had shown that appearances could be deceiving. By the time her shift ended, Rachel was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. But there was also a sense of satisfaction inside her, a feeling that something important had been learned that day. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, she couldn't help but smile to herself. It wasn't every day that you got to meet someone like Elon Musk. And it wasn't every day that you were reminded of just how important it was to treat people with kindness and respect, no matter who they were. As she stepped out of the cafe and into the cool evening air, Rachel felt a sense of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could become a little kinder, a little more thoughtful, because of moments like these. Rachel stared at the card in her hand, her heart racing. The name Elon Musk gleamed in elegant letters on the card, along with a phone number and email address. She could barely believe it, an opportunity to work for one of the most innovative and influential people in the world. Her mind swirled with thoughts. She had always been just a barista, serving coffee day in and day out, often feeling overlooked and undervalued. But now, standing there with this card in her hand, everything seemed to change in an instant. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cafe. She was still in shock, trying to process what had just happened. I don't know what to say. Elon smiled again, his expression softening. You don't need to say anything right now. Just know that kindness and professionalism like yours don't go unnoticed. You have potential, Rachel. Don't sell yourself short. Rachel nodded, still feeling overwhelmed. She had never imagined that being kind to a man who looked homeless would lead to something like this. It was a simple choice, treating someone with dignity, and now it was changing her life in ways she could never have predicted. Meanwhile, Mark stood frozen, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. The usually confident cafe owner seemed completely deflated, like the weight of his own mistakes had finally come crashing down on him. He looked at Elon, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find something to say, some way to salvage the situation. But there were no words that could fix what had happened. Elon turned his attention back to Mark, his expression more serious now. Mark, running a business is about more than just making money. It's about how you treat people. Your employees, your customers, even the ones you think don't matter. Mark swallowed hard, his voice weak as he spoke. I understand, Mr. Musk. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Elon nodded, though his expression remained stern. Apologies are a start, but they're not enough. You need to change how you run this place. Treat people with respect, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's how you build a business that lasts. The tension in the room was palpable as Mark nodded slowly, clearly humbled by the situation. I will. I promise. Things will be different from now on. Elon's gaze softened slightly, but there was still an edge to his tone. I hope so. Because businesses that don't learn from their mistakes don't survive. The weight of Elon's words seemed to settle over Mark like a heavy blanket. He nodded again, looking down at the floor, clearly ashamed. Rachel watched the whole interaction, feeling a strange mix of emotions: sympathy for Mark, but also a sense of satisfaction that justice was being served. Elon turned back to Rachel, his expression soft and encouraging. Remember, Rachel, you're not stuck where you are. There are always opportunities, and you've proven today that you deserve better. Don't hesitate to reach out. Rachel nodded, her heart full of gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Musk. I'll definitely think about it. With that, Elon gave a final nod, then turned and walked toward the door. The group of business people who had entered with him followed closely behind, leaving the cafe in stunned silence. As the door swung shut behind them, the room seemed to exhale all at once, as though the weight of the moment had finally passed. Rachel stood there for a few moments, still clutching the card in her hand, her mind racing with possibilities. The cafe had always been a safe, familiar place for her, but now she was beginning to realize that there was a whole world of opportunities out there, opportunities she had never considered before. Mark, still looking shaken, finally broke the silence. Rachel. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice full of regret. I never should have treated him like that. I never should have treated anyone like that. Rachel looked at him, her expression thoughtful. It's not just about how you treated him, Mark. It's about how you treat everyone. I've seen how you act toward people you think are beneath you. Today was a wake-up call, but you have to decide if you're really going to change. Mark's face flushed with embarrassment, and he nodded slowly. You're right, he admitted. I've been so focused on the business side of things that I forgot about the people. I need to do better. Rachel didn't say anything for a moment, letting his words sink in. She had worked for Mark for a long time, and while she had always respected him as her boss, she had also seen the way he could be dismissive, especially toward people he didn't think were important. Maybe today would be the turning point for him, the moment when he finally started to see people for who they were, not just what they looked like. I hope you do change, Rachel said finally, her voice soft but firm. Because everyone deserves to be treated with respect. Mark nodded again, his expression earnest. I will. I promise. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Rachel. Customers came and went, but everything felt different now. She kept glancing at the card in her pocket, thinking about the possibilities that lay ahead. Could she really work for someone like Elon Musk? It was a daunting thought, but at the same time, it filled her with excitement. The idea of stepping out of her comfort zone and into a new world of opportunities was thrilling. By the time her shift ended, Rachel was exhausted, but there was a new sense of energy buzzing inside her. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, she found herself smiling. The world felt bigger now, full of potential. As she walked out of the cafe and into the cool evening air, Rachel took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, twinkling in the fading light. She thought about the day's events, how everything had changed in just a few short hours, and realized that this was just the beginning. For the first time in a long time, Rachel felt like anything was possible. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let fear or doubt hold her back. There were opportunities waiting for her, and she was ready to take them. As she walked down the street, the card still in her pocket, Rachel smiled to herself. The world was full of surprises, and today had been proof of that. You never knew what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear: kindness, respect, and treating people with dignity could open doors you never even knew existed. As the door to the cafe swung closed behind Elon Musk, a sense of stillness settled over the room. The usual hum of chatter was replaced by an uneasy silence. Everyone was trying to process what had just happened. The man who had looked like just another homeless individual, someone they had dismissed without a second thought, had turned out to be one of the most influential people on the planet. And in his wake, he had left a lesson that none of them would soon forget. For the regular customers, the ones who had made quiet, condescending remarks about the scruffy figure by the window, the moment felt like a cold splash of water to the face. They had judged him based on his appearance, thinking him unworthy of any attention, much less the respect of a billionaire like Elon Musk. But now, as they sat in the cafe, the weight of their assumptions began to settle in. They had seen someone through the lens of their own prejudices, and they had been wrong. For Mark, the cafe owner, the lesson was even harder to swallow. As he stood behind the counter, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped down a coffee cup, he reflected on his own actions. He had been quick to judge, dismissive of the homeless man, and even quicker to demand that Rachel remove him. But in that moment, when he had stood face to face with Elon Musk, the truth had become clear: his behavior had been inexcusable. Treating people with respect, regardless of their appearance or station in life, was something that Mark would have to work hard to change. Rachel, however, stood in the middle of it all with a calm that surprised even her. Her mind was racing, but at the same time, she felt a sense of peace. The validation she had received from Elon Musk, the recognition of her kindness and professionalism, was a powerful reminder that what we do matters. When she had first walked over to the homeless man by the window, she hadn't been expecting anything to come of it. She hadn't been thinking about the possibility of meeting one of the world's richest and most famous figures. She had simply done what felt right. She had shown kindness when no one else would. And now, in the quiet aftermath of the reveal, she couldn't help but reflect on how much that moment had changed her. It wasn't just about the opportunity that Elon had given her, although that was exciting in its own right. It was about something deeper. It was about the realization that kindness and respect weren't just important values to live by, they were the foundation for success, for building relationships, and for making a difference in the world. That small act of decency, when no one was watching, had paid off in a way Rachel couldn't have imagined. As she stood there, still holding the card Elon had given her, she thought about the journey ahead. She didn't know what the future held. Maybe she would take him up on his offer, maybe she wouldn't. But what she did know for sure was that she was no longer content to remain in a job where she felt invisible, where her worth was overlooked. She had learned that her potential was much greater than the confines of her current life. And that realization was empowering. Rachel walked to the door, her thoughts swirling with possibilities. The evening air was cool against her skin, but it felt refreshing, like a new beginning. As she stepped outside, the sounds of the city washed over her: the distant hum of traffic, the murmur of voices, the rhythmic footsteps of people going about their business. It was a familiar scene, yet everything felt different now. The world felt larger, more open, full of potential. She had always believed that kindness was a value worth holding onto, even when it seemed like no one else cared. But now, she understood that kindness wasn't just about being a good person, it was also about seeing the good in others, regardless of who they were or what they had. It was about understanding that everyone, no matter their appearance or circumstances, had something valuable to offer. And that was the lesson Elon Musk had taught her. It wasn't just about the business world or the high-profile deals he made. It was about how we treat the people around us, no matter where they come from or what they look like. The world would be a better place if more people embraced that simple truth. As Rachel walked down the street, the weight of her thoughts slowly began to settle. She felt a quiet confidence growing inside her, a sense of knowing that she had the power to create change, not just in her own life, but in the world around her. She had been given an opportunity, yes, but she also knew that she was capable of so much more. The world was full of people just waiting to be seen, to be respected, and to be given a chance to prove their worth. That was the true power of kindness. Rachel smiled to herself, thinking about what she had learned that day. It wasn't just about getting a chance to work with someone like Elon Musk. It was about realizing that our worth isn't determined by how others see us, but by how we see ourselves and how we treat the people around us. It was about remembering that we all have something valuable to offer, even when the world seems to overlook us. She looked up at the sky, taking in the first stars of the evening. The world was full of possibility, and for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt ready to embrace it. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that whatever it was, she was prepared to face it with kindness, respect, and the belief that she, too, had something to offer. Sometimes, life gives us small tests, moments where we're asked to choose between what's easy and what's right. The true reward comes when we choose kindness, when we treat others with respect, no matter who they are. Because in the end, those are the moments that matter the most. And Rachel was ready for whatever came next, knowing that the power of kindness would always guide her along the way.